saw a familiar face walking on the avenue. Both surprised by the way we looked. The years had changed us too. We smiled and both embraced.
Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Gung Ho. It's June 11, 2018. I'm Joe Giannini. Many of you know me by now. I'm ex-Marine. Actually, there's no such thing as an ex-Marine. I was a criminal defense lawyer. I retired recently, and I have a special guest here today, Jeff Sussman, and we're going to be talking about boxing, which is a passion for me through my dad. And what happened is, recently I saw a story about Jeff that he had written a book called Marciano.
No, Rocky Graziano, Fist, Fame, and Fortune.
All right, sorry about that.
That's okay.
And I reached out to him and I went to his book event and here he is. All right.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
Okay. First of all, why do you write about boxing?
Well, when I was 12 years old, I was a skinny little kid, and my father was worried that bigger kids in school would pick on me. And my father had been an amateur boxer, and he knew boxers, and he was friends with Lou Stillman, who owned Stillman's Gym in the city. And one day he brought home a pair of boxing gloves for me. He brought home a speed bag, a heavy bag, and a jump rope, and he set them all up in the basement, and he taught me the elements of boxing. And after he figured I had mastered those, he then signed me up for 10 boxing lessons at Stillman's Gym, because he knew Lou Stillman, and he paid, I don't remember the man's name, his first name was Nick. He was an aspiring middleweight fighter, and he gave me 10 boxing lessons, and when it was all over, I got a Stillman's t-shirt.
Wow. Well, my dad did the same thing with me. When I was very young, 5, 6 years old, I was going around to all the gyms in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and he taught me how to box, and he was an amateur champion, and your father was an amateur fighter, you said,
yes.
Right? Yeah, and he loved it. All right, let's talk about Rocky Graziano.
Rocky Graziano was a hero of mine when I was a kid. I never saw him fight when I was a kid, but I had read his autobiography, Somebody Up There Likes Me, and I was fascinated by it because he was a juvenile delinquent, and I was on my way to being a juvenile delinquent. That's what I aspired to when I was a young teenager. And then I saw the movie that was made about him, starring Paul Newman, also called Somebody Up There Likes Me. And over the years, I didn't think about it too much. I did think about it when I was taking boxing lessons. But in 1963, I was living in Forest Hills, Queens, and I was working in the city. And it was a hot summer day, and I came out of the subway at about 6 o'clock at night, and I'm walking to my apartment building, and I see this guy. He looks very, very familiar. And I got closer and closer, and it was Rocky Graziano, who was living in Forest Hills at the time. And he was walking a little white, tiny poodle, which I thought was unusual for this tough middleweight fighter. And I walked up, and I could see that it was him. You know, the bridge of his nose was pushed in, and he had, you know, a couple of little scars around his eyes. And I went up to him, and I introduced myself, and I said, you know, I just think you're one of the great ones. And he said, thank you very much. I'll tell my wife you said so. And then he said he had to get the dog upstairs because he needed to give the dog a biscuit. Otherwise, the dog would take a bite out of his ankle.
Oh, boy. Well, I never saw him fight either, but I had the pleasure to see Carmen Basilio fight, Sugar Ray Robinson fight, Edward Charles, a lot of old fighters. And I was very, very young when I saw this fight with my dad.
Yeah.
But not him, not Graziano. Tell us a little bit more about, you know, how he came up, about before he actually became a boxer.
Well, he was born on the Lower East Side on 10th Street and 1st Avenue. His father was a failed middleweight boxer named Fighting Nick Barbella. And his father was very abusive to Rocky when he was little. Rocky's original name was Tommy Rocco Barbella. And he had an older brother named Joey. And the father, who's also an alcoholic, used to put boxing gloves on these two kids. And Joey was about 6 years older than Rocky, And he would encourage the two boys to fight. But because Joey was bigger and older, he always managed to beat up Rocky. Rocky refused to cry. But he developed incredible resentment towards his father and to his older brother. And he came from a very, very poor family. In addition to having an abusive father, his mother was a schizophrenic and was in and out of mental institutions much of her life. And the family would force Rocky to go out on the street in the winter and steal coal to put in the stove that was in their kitchen to keep the apartment warm. And then the rest of the time, they would also send him out to the beaches on Coney Island to dig up clams so they would have some protein in their diet. Eventually, he became a street kid, and he had a gang, and he was mugging kids, and when he was very young, he was stealing their lunches, he was stealing their lunch money, and he was on a path to become a career criminal. He admired criminals. He wanted to become a racketeer when he grew up. And years later, when he was asked, what did you used to steal? He said, I stole anything that began with an A refrigerator, a television, a car, a bicycle, anything. and then he dropped out of school when in the 6th grade. And also years later, someone asked him, why did you quit school in the 6th grade? And he said, because of pneumonia. And they said, oh, you had pneumonia? He said, no, I couldn't spell it, so I quit school. And he became he was becoming more and more of a tough guy and a street guy, and he was beating up people on the street. I mean, it didn't take much to anger him. He had a very short fuse. And he had a friend who was an aspiring fighter also named Terry Young. And Terry Young got him into fighting in clubs, like the $25 or $50, maybe a watch if you won. And Rocky was a natural at it. He wasn't a scientific fighter. He didn't have a strategy. He was really a brawler, and he could punch equally hard with both hands, though he had a devastating right cross. And eventually he was caught by the police, and he was sent to what they called a Catholic protectory, which was like a reform school. And while he was there, he met Jake LaMotta, and they became lifelong friends. And it was one of the interesting things. He said to Jake when they were in reform school together, he said, you've got to learn to control your anger. You're too angry. You've got to learn to control it. And here was this guy who was overwhelmed by his own anger. And they became friends. And when Rocky got out of reform school, he got drafted into the Army. And his mother thought this would be a good thing for him because it would...
Jeff, what year are we talking about now?
I think he got drafted in 1940 or 41.
All right, so right before or right after the war started?
Right, I think it was right after the war started he got drafted. And he had we were talking about drill sergeants. Well, he had a company, when he was in basic training at Fort Dixon, New Jersey, when reveille would blow in the morning, he'd refuse to get out of bed. He'd stay in bed till 10 o'clock. And when taps played at night, he was never around. He was out gambling or doing something else. And so he was developing a bad reputation, and he was called before the company commander. And the company commander said to him, so you think you're a tough guy, huh? So he said, yeah, and he flattened the company commander and took off. He went AWOL. And he went back to Stillman's gym, where Terry Young had introduced him to a manager there named Irving Cohn, who was managing a couple of welterweights and middleweights. And Irving said to him, so I hear you want to be a fighter. And he said, yes. And he said, well, you're a very handsome guy. You're almost pretty. Your face is going to get messed up if you... He said, I don't care. I want to be a fighter. And so he had 8 fights there, but he was worried because he was AWOL that the military police would find him. And they were looking for someone named Tommy Barbella. His sister had been dating a man named Rocky Graziano. And that Rocky Graziano was in prison for something. So Rocky figured he didn't need the name anymore because he's in prison. I'll take the name. So he adopted the name Rocky Graziano, and he fought 8 fights as a welterweight and won all 8 fights. And also Irving set him up with a very good trainer named Whitey Bimstein, who had trained a lot of famous fighters. And Whitey realized that you really couldn't keep Rocky on a short leash. He wanted to do things his own way. I mean, you could try to get him to train, you could try to teach him how to jab properly and so forth, but if he didn't want to do it, he didn't do it. Anyway, after winning the 8 fights, the military police caught up with him, and he was sentenced to 1 year in Leavenworth prison. And while he was in prison, he met this, I think he was an accountant or a bookkeeper or something, a small Jewish man from New York. And there was this big hillbilly from Tennessee who was picking on this little Jewish guy because he didn't like Jews. And Rocky liked this guy, so he beat up the hillbilly, who was a heavyweight, and was the heavyweight boxing champion of Leavenworth. So when the coach for the boxing squad saw this, he said to Rocky, "Well, you've got to, join the boxing squad. You just beat up our best boxer." So Rocky boxed all through his stay at Leavenworth, and he really began to hone his skills as a boxer. And when he got out, he went back to Stillman's. And Irving and Whitey.
Jeff, how old was he around this time?
Let me see.
He must have been pretty young.
I think he was about 30.
30?
I think so. Yeah. I'm trying to think of when he was born. He died in 1971. I'm sorry, 1991 he died, and he was 71 years. He was born in 1920. So he was 21, 22, 23 years old.
Yeah, he was very young.
Yeah, I'm sorry, he wasn't 30. And so he started as a welterweight, and every fight he had, he was doing terrifically. And but then he met a woman named Norma Unger, who introduced to him by his sister. She had tried setting him up on several dates, and he wasn't interested in. And one day she put them together, and he really fell very hard for her. He fell in love with her. And it was interesting because they came from 2 very different backgrounds. He came from a very poor Italian Catholic background. She came from a middle-class, educated Jewish background. And they just clicked. They just loved each other.
And the parents were okay with this?
There was nothing they could do about it. Well, it was funny because after they were married, they moved in with Rocky's parents, and Rocky's father didn't want to have anything to do with her. He didn't know that his son was a boxer. He heard of Rocky Graziano, but he didn't put 2 and 2 together that was his son. And he thought that this woman that he married was only encouraging him to continue being a thief. And so he didn't like her. And her parents, they were kind of mild-mannered and, whatever our daughter wants is fine kind of thing. And, but Rocky wanted to spend all of his time with Norma, and Irving said to him, you've missed a couple of fights, and the State Athletic Commission is going to revoke your license if you miss any more fights. Why don't you just marry this woman and then go home to her after a fight? And he finally did. And it was funny because he went to City Hall to marry her, and he needed 2 witnesses. And he saw 2 cops out in the hall and asked them to be his witnesses. And one of the cops was one of the people who had arrested him when he was young and sent him to reform school. So he was fighting. He married Norma. He was very, very happy with her. And she never went to any of his fights. She went to one, and she was so upset by how he was getting hurt that she could never go to any more of his fights. She was always there for him when he came home. And she would try listening to them on the radio, and she got so upset hearing that she would turn off the radio and have to go for a walk. And he had, he eventually advanced from a welterweight to a middleweight, and he had 3 of the bloodiest. A lot of people think 3 of the bloodiest middleweight fights of the 20th century with a man named Tony Zale.
Tell us a little bit about Tony Zale.
Tony Zale was known as the Man of Steel, not only because he came from the area, worked in the steel mills in Gary, Indiana, but also because they said he had a jaw that was made out of steel. It was very hard to knock him out. And he was a very, very powerful puncher. I mean one of his punches was like a punch to the liver, which was so hard that it could knock a person out. I mean, a lot of people didn't know that you could knock a person out hitting them so hard in the midsection, but you could. And Tony Zale had been racking up a lot of wins and so forth. And Rocky fought him And at the end of the fight, Tony Zale looked like he had to go to the hospital. He was a bloody mess. And Rocky didn't have a mark on him, but Rocky lost the fight. I think it was a TKO.
Was it a championship fight or just a...
It was a championship fight.
So they went 15 rounds?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And then they had a rematch in Chicago. And it was just the reverse. Rocky looked like a bloody mess, and Tony Zale didn't have a mark on him. And one of the things that happened to Rocky during this fight, which was used in one of the Rocky movies, was his left eye was so swollen that he couldn't see out of it. There was a big bulge over his left eye. And Whitey Bimstein, and whenever Rocky threw a left jab, he was off because he couldn't balance himself properly out of one eye. And Whitey Bimstein saw the problem he was having and took a $50 and pressed it into the bulge on his eye and cut the skin, and it drained. And after it drained, he was able to see out of his left eye, and he wound up knocking out Tony Zale and becoming the middleweight champion of the world. And he was so proud of himself. He had never done anything like this. Right after the referee, or the ring announcer, announced that he was the new middleweight champion, he grabbed the microphone and he shouted into the microphone, Ma, your bad boy done it, your bad boy done it. And he got back to his hotel room. His wife was staying in Chicago, and their little daughter was there. And his daughter woke up. She was in a crib when he came into the room. And she took one look at her father's face, and she said, Daddy, what happened to you? And he said, I told you not to play in the gutter. This is what happens when you play in the gutter.
And then he fought Tony Zale again.
A third time in New Jersey. And after he won the middleweight championship, a lot of this anger that he had left him. He accomplished something that he never thought he would accomplish. And he was always motivated by anger in his fights. And all of a sudden, he was surprised. He just didn't feel this anger anymore. And he went into that third fight with Tony Zale really not training, not caring that much. And he lost it. But he didn't seem to care that he lost it.
Did he get knocked out, or did he?
He did get knocked out.
And what happened to his career after that? Did he keep?
He kept fighting. But I just want to digress for a moment, because with his father, I said earlier that his father didn't know he was fighting under this name. Early in his career as a middleweight, Rocky went and gave his father 2 tickets to come see him fight at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, wow.
And the father said, thanks, kid. And he didn't know that his kid would be fighting. And so he took 1 ticket and he went to a bar and sold it and drank from the amount of money he got from 1 ticket. And then he took the 2nd ticket and he went to Madison Square Garden. And he had good seats for the fight. And the fighters come out of their dressing rooms and down the aisles, and Rocky takes off his robe, and all of a sudden he recognizes him. This is my son. He had no idea his son was a prize fighter. And after the fight, Rocky is in his dressing room, and he's getting a rub down from Whitey. And he opens his eyes, and there's his father standing over him with tears coming down his father's eyes. And after that, they completely reconciled. He was able to, because so much of his anger was going, he was able to forgive his father. And he understood that the reason his father was so angry and drank so much is because he failed as a boxer, and boxing had been his father's dream to success, and he never made it. He was at best a kind of journeyman middleweight.
So they reconciled. Were they able to spend some time together?
Yeah, there are some nice photographs of the two of them with their arms around each other.
And his dad lived long enough to spend time with him, and
yeah.
And his mom. What happened?
She died. I mean, they both died. I think they were in their 50s or 60s, and then Rocky his grandmother was still alive and had a very close a relationship with his grandmother.
Then something odd happened with Rocky, because most fighters get washed out. They die penniless, but something different happened.
Well, it was very interesting. But the next to last fight that Rocky had was with Sugar Ray Robinson. He said to Irving, he said, I want to test myself against the best there is out there. You know, I just want to see how I do against him. Maybe I'll do, you know, pretty well. And Irving advised him not to. He said, you know, I really think, you know, to be honest, you're past your prime. You know, Sugar Ray Robinson's very fast. He has, you know, terrific combinations, and you're basically a slugger. And Rocky said, I don't care. I want him. So they set up a match, and I think it went 4 rounds. Though in the 3rd round, I think it was, Rocky stunned Sugar Ray with what Sugar Ray later called the hardest right punch he had ever received in his career, and almost knocked him down. And then in the 4th round, Sugar Ray knocked him out. And you can see Rocky, if you look on YouTube, he's holding on to the ropes with one hand, and he's lost control of his right leg. It's just kind of jiggling as he's lying on the canvas.
That's the sign that he was really hurt.
Yeah, yeah. And then he had one more fight with a man named Chuck Davey, and he lost that. And it wasn't much of a fight, and he didn't think too much of Chuck Davey. He really went through the motions for the money eventually. So what happened also was that Irving was a very benevolent manager. He looked out for Rocky. And they used to have lunch frequently at P.J. Clark's restaurant on 55th Street and 3rd Avenue. And while they were having lunch one day, he said to Rocky, you know, I want you to take your money and I want you to invest it in annuities, because chances are, you know, when your fight career is not going to last more than 10 years. And then what are you going to do for a living? You're going to need money to live on. And, you know, so many fighters, they blow their money or their managers steal it from them, and you're not going to have anything. So look, invest it in annuities and you'll be fine. And he did that. So then Rocky started, he was very popular. By the time his career ended, the 2 most popular Italian Americans in America were Rocky Graziano and Frank Sinatra.
Were they friends?
They were friends. Frank Sinatra came to Stillman's gym to take boxing lessons in 1940, and they met. And there was an assistant to Whitey Bimstein, I can't remember his name offhand, who gave Sinatra boxing lessons and introduced him to Graziano, and they became pals, Sinatra and Graziano. And there's some photographs of them together. One is in a nightclub where they were enjoying themselves. And he started doing television commercials and making money from them. And then he did a short-lived TV show with the comedian Henny Youngman, where he played Henny Youngman's straight man. So he would ask Henny, Henny would come in and say something like, oh, my best friend just went to the doctor, and the doctor diagnosed him with a terminal illness. And Rocky said, well, that's terrible. What's going to happen? He said he went back to the doctor and to make sure, and the doctor said, you know, I'm positive, you know, this is terminal. You know, you just have 6 months to live, maybe. And Rocky said, that's terrible. And then what happened? He said, well, the doctor gave him a bill, and my friend couldn't pay it. So he said to the doctor, I can't pay the bill. And the doctor said, okay, I'll give you another 6 months to live. So they did those kinds of jokes on the show.
So he was okay financially, emotionally, happy guy.
Yeah, and then when the Henny and Rocky show ended, he was back at Stillman's, and I just want to tell you, he became a very kind, very generous man. He's sitting in Stillman's gym watching the up-and-coming fighters, and he sees an old fighter he knew who's gone blind, and he's sitting in a corner, and he knows the guy's living on welfare, and he's in some dingy hotel downtown. And he goes around and takes up a collection from everyone in Stillman's, and he also puts some of his own money in the collection. And he goes up to this old fighter, and he puts the money in his breast pocket, and he says, this is for you, and I want you to come back every month. You're going to get the same thing.
Wow.
He became one of the kindest, most benevolent.
How old was he when he died?
71. He had a cardiopulmonary disease. And
how many children?
2. He had 2 daughters, Audrey and Roxy.
And are they still alive?
I think Roxy's alive. Audrey died.
Boy.
It was funny. He got his biggest TV part was with the Martha Raye show, and the producer of the show, the director of the show, a man named Nat Hiken, sitting around with the producers and the advertising people, and they need someone to play the boyfriend of Martha Raye. And one of the advertising guys says, you know, we need a kind of stupid, inarticulate guy like Rocky Graziano. And then somebody else says, well, why don't we get Rocky Graziano? So Hiken went down to Stillman's gym, And he sees Rocky, and he introduces himself, and he says, "Do you have an agent?" And Rocky says, "I don't have an agent, but I have a friggin' manager. He's over there in the corner." And they go and talk, and he says, "Your manager says it's all right for you to take a part on this TV show. Would you do it?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll do it." And he was so popular, and the audience loved him so much that after 3 months, they doubled his salary. And he became, he went into millions of homes.
And what was the name of the show?
It was called The Martha Ray Show. And she was one of the most popular TV comedians at the time.
I remember her. I
Yeah.
remember her. And I want to tell you one thing about her. She came to Vietnam.
Oh, I know.
Maybe right before I got there, and she went up to Khe Sanh, which was the base that was under siege for a while in '68. She was up there. No other stars came up that far. Nobody.
She was very devoted to supporting the military and to supporting soldiers, and I think she's the only woman who's buried in a military, one of the famous military cemeteries.
We only have a few seconds left, actually about 40. I'm great I made the call, I'm great we met. And,
Me too.
I think maybe we should follow up with a show, maybe just talking about our fathers and more about boxing. Would
I'd
you
love
like to
to.
do that?
Absolutely.
All right, very good. Well, people out there don't know this, but they're gonna find out. I was in the boxing business, every part of it, and I helped Gleason's open in Brooklyn. I promoted, I managed, and my dad worked for me
Really?
while I was doing this, and he died
That was
while he
nice.
was doing that.
Yeah.
He died. All right. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure too.
'Cause friends are friends for